So my name is Micah May. I am Director of Ebook Services for the Digital Public Library of America. A few quick DPLA related announcements. First of all, I'd like to give a special thank you to our Head of Communications, Kat Williams, who is instrumental in facilitating these and all of our events behind the scenes and really a rock star. So thank you, Kat, for all of your help behind the scenes, setting these up and making them successful. I'd also like to let folks know DPLA has for a while, since our award-winning publication of an ebook version of the Mueller report, been doing some experimental ebook publishing, all openly licensed titles, and we just released a book called January 6th on the Record, which is a compendium of documents related to the January 6th hearings, free and openly licensed, added to our recent publication of the ebook version of the Dobbs report. So Kat will drop a link to those in chat if anyone's interested. Just one quick procedural announcement. If you have questions, which we really hope you will, this is meant to be a discussion after brief comments from the panelists. Please put them in the Q&A box. You can use the chat for sort of commentary, but if there's something you'd like the panelists to respond to, please use Q&A. We think that's better to manage. The publications I mentioned are part of an open collection DPLA curates called the Palace Bookshelf, which now has over 15,000 free titles available to libraries and the general public at the Palace Bookshelf.dp.la, which Kat will also drop a link to. I also want to mention an upcoming event. Our next book talk will be on October the 8th. Raquel Gutierrez, the author of Brown Neon, will be leading that book talk. So I hope anyone's interested will join us for that chat. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to our host and MC today, Michael Blackwell. Michael Blackwell, who you probably all know, is the director of the St. Mary's County Library and one of the founders and the leader of Readers First. Readers First is an organization dedicated to ensuring that library users have the same open, easy, and free access to ebooks that they've relied on through libraries with physical books. And Michael has been shepherding that organization for a number of years and hugely contributing to making sure that libraries have good access to ebooks. So with that, I'll pass this to Michael for an introduction to our panelists and to conduct this discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Micah, and my blushes. In this, our fourth Collaborating for Access series of webinars, we're going to look at the recent push for ebook legislation and what it could mean for access to digital content. We've brought together a panel of thought leaders to discuss the progress of various legislative efforts, potential ramifications, and what might come next. And one reason I just love participating in these Collaborating for Access is that we get such great panelists. And thank you for COSLA and for DPLA for lining folks up. And alphabetical order by last name. First, Kyle Courtney, who's the copyright advisor at Harvard University and the co-founder and board chair of Library Futures. Welcome, Kyle. And Alan Inouye, the senior director for public policy and government relations with the American Library Association. Welcome, Alan. Briana McNamee is the Director of Government Relations and Advocacy for New York Library Association. Welcome, Briana.
Thank you.
And finally, Irene Padilla, the State Librarian for the Maryland State Library. And welcome all. So let's begin with you, Alan. Please give us some background on what's been happening with legislation, especially at the state level. How long have efforts been going on? And why have so many happened in the last 2 years?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Michael. So this has been going on for a while. Some of you may remember February of 2011. That's when HarperCollins instituted its 26 checkout new license. And then there's a lot of media and meetings and controversy, and people were, just outraged. And ALA established a digital content working group and a campaign and so on. But back at that time, though, there were some legislative initiatives. And the most successful one, in particular, was in Connecticut, which actually passed a law, an act concerning a study regarding the availability of electronic books to users of public libraries. signed by the governor in June of 2013. So that started as a access to ebooks kind of bill, but it morphed into a study, which was actually done and led to some statewide initiatives. So it was successful. Since then, though, there have been 8 bills introduced since 2020 in Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maryland, Illinois, Missouri, and Tennessee. Now these bills vary, and there's been an evolution that we're going to discuss on this panel. In the series, Maryland, I guess you could say, is the baseline, and it's the simplest and most direct bill. And then there have been variations since then. And so why has this happened in the last couple of years? So my view is that it really emanated from the Macmillan embargo proposal and the short implementation thereof. We in the library community found that to be totally unacceptable, as many of you will remember, violating the library mission and values. So it's not just the dollars, but philosophically, it was an assault on librarianship. And there was this huge pushback, media. ALA had its eBooks for All campaign. There was a petition. There was a lot going on there. But the other reason I believe was also personal, is John Sargent's style of doing it, that let's just say it was I think universally off-putting to librarians. And that really fed the intensity of the opposition by libraries. So it went beyond we disagree with a business decision. And so I think that really infuriated people, and that provided a lot of fuel to these state level legislative efforts.
Well, thank you. And certainly there's been a lot of passion in the library world in the last 2 years. Briana, we're going to move to you. Let's look at in detail at some of those state legislative efforts that Alan talked about. And New York was one of the first states to be moving on this, along with Connecticut. And how was that legislation drafted where you are, and what did you hope to accomplish with it?
Sure. So I'm going to focus primarily, obviously, like on our ebook bill, or what we call it, our ebook for all bill. But I would be remiss if there was a law passed, a bill passed way back in 2015 that was a study bill, much like Alan just discussed, where it was really just a study that was looking at how ebooks were going to be made available to users by our state's public libraries, and then develop recommendations for increasing access. So that was before my time and not what we're really focused on here. But I do want to mention that, that we were out there in the beginning too. So, but in New York, we started in 2020. That was the first rendition of our bill, and it was introduced by our Assembly Library Chair, Sean Ryan, and a newcomer in the Senate, Rachel May. We introduced that in January of 2020 and really didn't see any traction, maybe because of the pandemic. But fast forward to the 21-22 session, and that's when we really started to pick up momentum. So our bill was amending our business law, and it was going to require that publishers who offered electronic books to the private market, that they would extend licenses to libraries within our state without discrimination. And we stipulated what reasonable terms were within those contracts, and also put some specifications as far as what wouldn't be considered reasonable and what those prohibitions would be. Through our original prints all the way to the B print, which was passed and delivered to the governor, we had those stipulations in place and did end up including some violations that would be addressed by our Attorney General and impose some civil penalties. So it took about 2 years from start to finish, which is incredibly expeditious when we're talking about the legislative process. So we were able to do that. And our goal in New York, I think from my time coming in, was to be a template. To be quite honest, we knew that New York housed the big publishers and that we would get strong opposition, but the goal was to get to the governor, and if we could create a template that other states could see as something to begin with or framework and craft so that it could be implemented within their own sections of law, whether that be consumer protection or business. You know, that was going to be ideal. So to get it all the way to the governor and, you know, see that veto 2 days before the new year definitely was heart-wrenching. But I'd like to think that we were successful in at least continuing the conversations and sparking some interest in other states.
Well, the vote is nearly unanimous, one single negative vote cast, which just goes to show how incredibly important these bills are and how we can overcome partisan differences for libraries. But tell us a little about the campaign that was mounted to pressure the governor to veto it. What happened there?
Yeah, so we had back in 2020, when we had originally crafted our legislation, we had a great groundswell support campaign where we had over 10,000 letters that were sent to the legislature. So I really do think that that was a catalyst for the support that we ended up seeing in 2021. And coming into the 2021 session, like you said, we only had one opposition vote out of a 250 plus body. So pretty incredible. And when it got to the time to that we knew it had passed both houses and we were awaiting delivery to the governor, it was really on some of our key advocates to make sure that program and council and those who were taking a deep dive into what potential opposition was, give them the correct information about what federal law is, what restrictions are, because we knew that we were facing some opposition, not only at a national level, but also with some smaller NPOs here as well. So have to thank, you know, you all at ALA and beyond, as well as our advocates for, you know, just really providing as much information and impact as possible.
What struck me most about that opposition was that it wasn't primarily or necessarily just from the publishers. Practically anybody who had a stake in licensing, radio, music, television, movies, advertising signed off to try to have the governor veto this bill. And I think we need in libraries to know that there's going to be substantial opposition as we try to move forward on any of these, anytime we're going to challenging licensing. So looks like our legislative efforts may have to get away from that. So speaking of which, Irene, Maryland's bill, which is nearly identical to New York, did become law, and in practically record time. I mean, one session, we started in January, and by June we had a law. It was then challenged on the basis of copyright preemption and struck down. So tell us more about what happened, and do you think any good has come from this effort?
Well, first of all, Michael, thank you. And I want to thank Briana and the state of New York for their leadership on this issue. We really appreciate it. And we were as devastated as you were when your law was struck down. So meanwhile, we were working on our own bill here in Maryland, and during the 2021 session of the General Assembly, ebook legislation was passed and enacted into law in May 2021, making Maryland the first state in the nation to ensure equal access to ebooks for public libraries. The bill required a publisher who offers to license an electronic literary product to the public to also offer to license the product to public libraries in the state on reasonable terms that would enable improved access to these products. The law was scheduled to take effect on January 1st, 2022. In December 2021, the American Association of Publishers filed suit against the Maryland Attorney General, seeking to enjoin and overturn this law. I have to say, I approached our Attorney General's office with trepidation when relaying this news, knowing how much extra work this would require on their part. Surprisingly, they were very eager and enthusiastic to be able to take on such a high profile and challenging case. I'm not sure how they felt after their team of 4 attorneys assigned to the case spent countless hours preparing written briefs, and in preparation for oral argument, the defendants replied in support of the motion to dismiss and all of the subsequent filings that were required. But they maintained their poise and involvement throughout. So a dedicated team of experts assisted the AG's office, including Alan Inouye, Jonathan Band, and of course, our Maryland team led by Michael Blackwell. And this group worked together to respond to the lawsuit, filing many, many amicus briefs and other information that would help the AG's office. Despite our best efforts, Maryland did not prevail on the suit. On February 16, 2022, the U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland granted a preliminary injunction of Maryland's library digital book law. The decision not to appeal the court's ruling was based on the following issues. The Maryland AG's office did not anticipate a successful court outcome based on this opinion. There was a very short timeline to respond, less than 2 weeks. An appeal to the Fourth Circuit would have to show an abuse of the judge's discretion. And finally, the Maryland State Library Agency would be responsible for discovery costs, attorney's fees, and transcripts if we appealed the ruling. This was something I could not afford without causing harm to the many other services we provide. Finally, on June 13th, the AAP's request for a declaratory judgment on the premise that Maryland law conflicts with and is preempted by the U.S. Copyright Act was granted. However, the judge agreed with us that the grant of a permanent injunction was not necessary. On August 10th, we learned that the AAP filed a notice with the court indicating that despite their initial and subsequent filings asking that Maryland pay their court costs, they decided not to proceed with their request for attorney's fees and costs in this case. And I, as grateful as I am about that, I also know that I believe the AAP was aware that this would have caused outrage if they had gone ahead and requested attorney's fees and costs. Maryland librarians would have been outraged, and I think that outrage would have been shared nationally.
Well, thank you very much for that. And yes, it was a big disappointment for us in Maryland when that was struck down. I would say some good has come from it, though. For one thing, we have some indication from our partners that Amazon and Audible, who had previously not been providing content to libraries, came on board in response to this law, and you can get their content now through the Palace app that Micah was talking about. I'd say it also helped to establish the library's position. So New York, an example, us an example that people are learning from. And with that, we can turn to Massachusetts. And Carl, you're a resident there, and you've been somewhat involved with drafting the bill, which kind of learned from Maryland. How does that version differ from what's been set forth in other states? And what did you learn from those other states? And how is this bill different then? And what will we do if it becomes a law?
That was a lot of questions, Michael. So I'm going to try to handle those one at a time. First, here in Massachusetts, so I'm a lawyer for libraries, right? So I dislike licensing that takes away the library mission. And often these licenses do that, right? They take away our ability to loan, to preserve, to provide access, or all the things that are core elements of what a library needs to do with material. So I don't like licensing, but if I'm going to have to deal with the realm of licensing, I would prefer that the licensing, like my colleagues have said, were more reasonable. That term has yet to be defined well. We tried to define it, but it backfired slightly. But in this case, ultimately, if we're going to stay in the realm of licensing and governing these contracts, then we can adjust the contracts themselves. So Michael and I have been in touch the whole time, tongue in cheek, going, I wonder what's going to happen to Maryland. And Massachusetts, with my colleagues in the Massachusetts Library Association, specifically the legislation division, they were talking a lot about, well, let's do the wait and see. Once the decision was announced and we smelled what was going to happen, the pivot that we suggested was there is a bill in Massachusetts and several other states that looked a lot like the Maryland bill, in that it had the language in it, which the court had struck down. So we thought elimination of that language, which tread into the realm of copyright, was necessary. But Nevertheless, could we get these licenses under the purview of different areas of law to match the library mission? So we explored the notion of libraries are consumers, right? And the idea is that we buy stuff, just like citizens buy stuff, we buy stuff too. So why not harness the power of consumer protection law? We happen to have a very powerful consumer protection law here in Massachusetts, which says any contracts that have unfair or deceptive acts or practices that harm the public will be rendered void, basically, or possibly voidable by a court. So we thought these are unfair and deceptive acts and practices, these licensing schemes that prevent us from doing our mission. Our second thing was most states have adopted something called the Uniform Contract, the UCC, sorry, the UCC, which basically creates a system by which contracts are governed that are very similar in all 50 states. The UCC gives the powers of the court to strike down portions of the law that are unconscionable. That's a good word, but basically so devoid of public interest that they should be avoided. And then last, we have contractual preemption, which says if things appear in this contract that are counter to the mission of libraries, then they should just be straight up ignored in that contract. Contract preemption has driven a lot of it. So these ideas, and these are some of our crazier ideas that we were accused of being big library, and that we were shooting a torpedo. Recently, the head of AAP said that Library Futures work was shooting a torpedo at the Copyright Act. We are not big library. We are 4 people with some ideas. So Massachusetts gathered together and wrote a memo to the committee that was overseeing the bill and said, we think we should pivot in these particular directions, focusing on the strength of Massachusetts. Now, we also did this in Connecticut and also in Rhode Island as well, because I wanted New England on lock. We wanted to pivot to be able to help the constituents of these areas. So we had meetings, we submitted written testimony, oral testimony, the MLA here, the Massachusetts Library Association, moved mountains to have everyone come and talk about, we need to pivot. And you know what? This area of law is just nuanced enough to be annoying, right? That idea that, what do you mean it's not copyright? Well, we're trying to fix something else and make these terms of these licenses more manageable for the library. We're special. Basically, we're telling the legislatures, we're special. We need a special contract that recognizes the public service that libraries do. So the pivot, of course, was also, when it went to committee, was wait and see. We testified on a day that was about circus animals and libraries. So it was a literal circus in the day that we were testifying about the structure of this bill. It got put into study committee, which my colleagues have mentioned, a study bill is important. In Massachusetts, the study committee is where a bill goes to die, unfortunately. However, our representatives that we worked with have reached out to us and are hopeful in the new term, we will not be fighting this uphill battle. We'll just go straight to the contract law provisions. So that's what we're hopeful for the future, Michael. I think I answered all your questions you asked me.
So can I just chime in really quick? I'm going to be keeping my eyes so closely on New England, because what you just referenced with starting with consumer protection and defining what deceptive practices are is exactly where we started in 2020 and what our original 2890, our bill number, was. And it was basically through the eyes in the review process of internal analysts where they're like, whoa, like consumer protection is like expansive in New York, and actually where our next sort of pivot in 2023 is going to be back there in a different way. But they said, this is very neat and tidy here. There's really no place for you, because we made that, but we're special. So we made that argument too, that they're like, well, can't you just add a new section, but reference all of the penalties, procedures, and policies that are already in place? So we were asking to be recognized as special, but in the same time being like, but we'll just do everything else that's in law too, because that favors us.
Right. I mean, that's the distinct advantage, right? The laws already exist here. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. By the way, I'll put this in the chat. We outlined all this in a policy paper a few months ago, if you'd like to see. One other thing, Briana, that you just brought up that reminded me of it. We didn't explore this as closely because each state is very different. But the idea of procurement laws is another area we've been touching upon. If
We
the
looked there
state
too,
is
yeah.
going to spend money on stuff, we want the ultimate value, ultimate access, and it needs to the public. And when I was at the hearing in Connecticut, where we were attempting to do the pivot, the state senator there really put the the thumbnail screw, so to speak, on the AAP representative, said, so we're just throwing money out a window every time we have to rebuy our collections over and over. The state needs to get different terms for our ebooks. And that was something that was interesting.
Yeah, we looked into procurement law as well. New York, I think every state probably has very different procurement laws. And within New York State, at least, when we are talking about licensing, it really comes down to our 23 individual library systems and not through the state. So while the state library does have their own, the majority of what we're talking about is public libraries, and there's definitely not a one size fits all, as I feel like almost every library community state knows. So
no, and this is why it's been fun. We've been shopping this model built to other states recently, and we've had to do some localized research, right? What law do you have? Did you pass the UCC? What's your state procurement law? How strong is your consumer protection law? But opening up many fronts, I think, is the answer, as
Yeah.
opposed to one singular one, right? I
I
think
feel like the vetoes and the feedback that our opposition has given us, is at least in New York, again, like we're looking at different directions. I think we have a good one to go into in 2023, but they just gave us fuel to fueled our fire. And now we have their tells. Like we know what the feedback is going to be. So thanks for giving me all of that knowledge, because now I know exactly what to work around. So.
Well, I had a follow-up question for Kyle, but I'm going to hold on to that because it will also work once we hear from a little bit more about what's happening in New York, and then when we hear what's happening in Maryland. Briana, anything to add to what you just said about sort of future plans in New York?
Sure, I'll be cryptic and PC because I don't want to give away too much, but we are going back to viewing this through a consumer protection lens and not so much about the actual procurement of the title itself. And we are actually going to be doing this piecemeal style, as the way I can describe it is we are still, although not because of Corona, but because of other health emergencies, we're still in a declaration of emergency. So we're going to be looking at consumer protection with emergency declarations and market volatility. And so without going too much into it, we're really going to try to broach the subject from, again, almost like a price gouging in times of emergency and times of market volatility, and go start small and go big after that. So happy to answer specific questions, but I don't want to give away too much before we have a number in writing. So
all right, so maybe somebody could enter this question in the Q&A box for me, and that is, what do libraries consider to be fair? I think that's the question we want to answer. But Briana, it sounds very much like you were taking a page out of the New England book, or you had already anticipated and you're going back to it, and it's not going to challenge them on the basis of copyright. It is going to be much more some other aspect of getting to what could be fair. Irene, what is happening in Maryland? Is there any new effort there?
So I'm really learning a lot from this session, and thanks Kyle and Briana for your information. We will certainly take that into consideration. So moving forward, Maryland's public library community is watching the issues closely as they are playing out with legislation, as I just mentioned, in Massachusetts, what's going on in New York, as well as the Internet Archives lawsuit. The goal is to work with the information we've learned from this ruling and from other states. Our Maryland librarians are working to create tools to educate the public on the issues libraries face and providing them with access to digital materials. What libraries have to pay for those materials in the growing digital divide created in part by the unfair licensing practices of publishers. And ALA has offered use of its materials as well. Ultimately, we hope to introduce new legislation using a different focus to achieve our goals, and I think the consumer protection angle is well worth researching and looking at. At that time, we hope to have a better educated community who support the principle of equal access for all, understand the value and necessity of libraries and ensuring that access, and appreciate the toll that the current practices are taking on their tax dollars. And partly, there's a little bit of hesitation in Maryland to move directly forward. This coming session, which would be 2023, our General Assembly meets January through April. So we're gearing up for that, but there is a little bit of hesitation in getting right back into presenting a new bill. We want to learn more, as I mentioned, from other states and from what's going forward with the Internet Archives lawsuit, but also we feel that we need to build a groundswell of support from our patrons and library users so that we have more support going forward.
Well, we do have a draft of a bill based on procurement, and I've actually shared that with Kyle. Yes, so for Maryland, we're looking at a year. We're going to post a website. We're going to reach out to the community and try to build some support there before we introduce a new bill. So that was a disappointment for me, but I understand the Maryland Library Association wanting to do it that way. So that's kind of where we are in Maryland. Kyle, do you want to say anything else about library futures for right now?
Sure.
Sure.
I love talking about library futures, Michael, you know that. Library futures was formed specifically just to deal with these narrow issues, right? That's the whole thing. I think, and state law is not always about copyright. The ones that everyone's talking about here, I must admit, I think the court got it wrong. I don't think it's a federal preemption issue. I'm a copyright person. It's just nuanced enough though to be annoying, right? So they didn't want to go all in. But the advantage here is by framing this work, and library futures is basically saying state law governs the formation of contracts and licenses traditionally, right? It can mandate that terms are fair and practical. It can clearly define legal concepts, which we've done. And most importantly, state courts are more likely to understand state contract law, right? So it goes in front of a state court instead of a federal court, and to look favorably on state laws that protect citizens, our patrons, and their public access. I think the important part here is also it's not just the carrot, there's a little bit of the stick, right? So some of these laws that we're talking about involves some sort of state government oversight on behalf of libraries, right? So when you get something declared unfair in a deceptive act or practice, what you're doing is saying, I need the coercive power of the state to help me, the library, negotiate terms that are more fair. So library futures we've really spun this out. And like Briana, I think it's smart that we don't give away our tells here. We are talking with multiple states, right? That are considering this, that understand it. And honestly, states can legally enforce their roles as purchasers for goods and services, especially if they benefit the public. I took my influence from the net neutrality state laws that basically said, right, there was a failure for having a free and open internet policy, got rolled back, unfortunately, by the federal government. So the states started acting. California and Vermont and other states said, if you want the juicy state internet government contract and servicing our citizens here in this state, here's the 6 things you need to do. And the 6 things happen to be the same 6 things that a net neutrality policy would be at the federal level. So I'm saying, if you want the juicy dollars, millions of dollars revenue from libraries, which they do want, then you have to comply with these 6 things and under these laws. And it's not like there's not federal action. We have been in touch, as many of you saw, I think it was last year or the year before. Time is just a construct. Senator Wyden and Representative Eshoo sent the major 5 publishers a list of questions about their ebook practices with regards to libraries and access. The federal government is also looking at this. It's not stopped. They have all the answers. They're looking at the publishers and the aggregators. It's just a little slower than the state. State can be very rapid. The Massachusetts bill was introduced because a patron called the director of a public library, the public library director called their representative, Ruth Belser, who I will give a shout out to, and she had that draft in pretty quick. So a lot of the stuff that can happen on the state level is faster, and that's why we've choose to pivot in that direction strategically.
Well, it's a testimony to the power of libraries that legislators are following what we do, that they are concerned, and that there are many public voices in support of libraries.
Yeah, there's not one
Yeah.
meeting that we've taken with Library Futures with any of the staffers, representatives, or the people that don't say, this is a good issue, right? This is a good issue.
Yeah, and that's why we see them as unanimous passage in many legislatures. It's sort of like you tell the legislators and they get it, they understand. Go slightly off. I did have a script for those of you in the audience we were following. I'm going to go slightly off script because you just talked about federal efforts. Alan, we're going to pivot over to you for now. And from a national perspective, why do you think these efforts have been important? How has the ALA helped? And have there been any efforts at a federal level for library copyright or licensing controls?
Yeah. So, I mean, the obvious one is, of course, is try to get possible progress in a given state. But some of the benefits have already been mentioned. Michael, for example, you mentioned Amazon and Audible, so that, we believe that because of the state legislative efforts, that has provided increased incentive for some industry players to reconsider or to be more accommodating. That there is this kind of interaction, right? It's not just that everything is in a silo. And Kyle and some others have mentioned the goodwill that we've gotten from the state legislators. So it's actually a way, it actually creates more goodwill about libraries and publicizes libraries. And when you talk about this issue, that the unanimous votes or the almost unanimous votes, I mean, clearly indicate that, that we're in the right, that libraries are being treated unjustly, and the state legislatures see that immediately with their votes. And so it's a big win for us in that sense, in terms of the goodwill game at the state level. And as far as federal efforts, it's also useful because it demonstrates back home support. So if you're a member of Congress, one of the first things you think about is, well, do my constituents care? Because that's kind of how they're wired, and that's how they get reelected. And so knowing that, like in Maryland, well, yeah, clearly they care a lot. And even the state legislature cares too, right? So it's like that helps in federal efforts. As far as ALA, that's already been mentioned a bit so far. So generally our position is that as a national organization, we don't intervene directly at the state level because we don't know the politics or the key influencers or the media market. And also the state library, the librarians at the state, within a state, they set their own priorities. And so digital books is a big priority, of course, but sometimes, fighting book banning or appropriations might be a bigger priority in a given year. And so we don't know that here in Washington, right? They have to decide. And so then that's why it's another reason why it's important to work through the state level folks. As far as what ALA can do in terms of providing resources or legal advice, there's also advice and resources on communication strategies and support, and we can partner when it makes sense. We have a copyright counsel, Johannesen Band. We also have some senior fellows, Sari Feldman, a former ALA president, who worked a lot on the earlier ebook campaigns, and a new senior fellow named Marjorie Blumenthal, who's a veteran in the Washington policy arena, and some other folks too that we use. And so that we're here to help however we can. And going forward, we do have a document that's gonna be coming out fairly soon, but not publicly. All of you folks can get it, but we don't want it to get into the hands of people who don't agree with us. So it won't be a public release per se. It'll be sent to library advocates only. As far as federal,
Don't go ahead. No, go ahead. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay, yeah. So the last part is just on the federal side. So copyright, of course, is a longstanding issue. We work through groups such as the Library Copyright Alliance and the Recreate Copyright Coalition. And it's been an interest of mine going back for 2 decades. I was a study director for the first national study on digital copyright called The Digital Dilemma when I was at the National Academy of Sciences way back. I won't say how many years. So, more than a few. And more recently, in terms of this issue, in September, October of 2019, ELA was invited by the House Judiciary Committee to submit comments on their investigation on competition in digital markets. And so we submitted a brief. And that was kind of the beginnings, I guess, of this last iteration, if you will, at the federal level. And we have worked with a few offices on possible legislation. It's been slow going. And then, yes, they did hear from our friends on the other side, so to speak. And so that slowed it down even more. So right now we're waiting to see how the midterms go. And I'm afraid that we may be in a defensive posture in copyright and licensing in the next Congress. In general, it's not a clean partisan issue. You might think that, well, Democrats tend to be our biggest supporters in libraries and Republicans not, which of course is not true either. It's a complex mix, but with copyright, it's even more complex because you think about the closeness or collaboration between Hollywood and many Democratic leaders or elected officials. And so it makes it even more complex. And finally, we are concerned about, or not concerned, but at least we're looking at if things change in Congress, that, for example, Tom Tillis, who chairs the subcommittee on IP, now he's a ranking member of the Senate subcommittee on IP. And so if the Republicans take control of the Senate, then he becomes chairman of the subcommittee on IP. And so that could be a challenge for us. And Jim Jordan is currently the ranking House member in the House Judiciary Committee. So if the Republicans take the House, then he becomes chairman of the House Judiciary. And so these kinds of changes in the Congress can make things more challenging for us going forward. And then we may have to take a even more defensive posture than we have of late.
Well, I don't think it's letting any cats out of the bag to say that one of our hopes with state laws is that if some are passed and with stand up to scrutiny, that at the federal level, this will draw great attention to this issue. I'm going to say something really snarky about a senator. Senator Tillis, you sick the Copyright Office on Maryland when our law went forward. Talk to your librarians and see what they're paying for ebooks, please. With that, I'm going to turn to questions, and we've got quite a few of them. And this is for the whole panel, nobody in particular, although I will say, Kyle, you're getting a shout out. Great job representing Massachusetts. We have people from Representative Balzer's office online today too. So you are being watched. And
Huzzah. No,
yeah,
that's my
Thank
favorite
so
office
much.
in Massachusetts currently.
There we go. I will, from Richard, I can answer one fairly quickly. Are any of your problems related to patrons' objections to certain topics and books? And the answer for this particular issue is no. I will say that ebooks are a censor's dream. Imagine being able to, and this has happened in one place, the overdrive was basically taken down. Imagine being able to just get rid of thousands of library books at once. But generally speaking, no, this is a separate issue and not really related to the unfortunate record number of questions and challenges that are being put forward towards libraries. Let's see, from Diane, thank you. Maybe this is naive, but how are publishers both able to claim copyright protection and licensing protection in contracts so that we should, if we get something, be able to distribute it, but no, you can't. Anybody want to take that one on?
I mean, it's a mess. Let's start with that right away, in that these two areas of law are separate, right? Categorically, right? Contract law and copyright law. However, they overlap in significant ways. My course, Copyright First Responders, I say, you can't teach a copyright course nowadays without getting to contract and licensing, because you can license away your copyright. So in many of these cases, it feels like the publishers are double dipping a little bit, right? They're saying, okay, well, you can't make us sell to anyone, right? This is America. I don't have to sell it to anyone I don't want to, and I definitely don't want to sell to libraries. That was basically the decision in Maryland wrapped up into with a bow on it, right? We don't have to sell to you because that would force copyright holders to do this. And then they say, but we do offer these great licenses. Now we think they're terrible, right? Because they're not reflective of the library mission. So they're utilizing both ends of the coin here, and this is why I think the revolution that Alan has noted, like this started a while ago, right when the 26 checkouts were launched, has reached a fevered pitch because I think the system is entirely untenable. And looking at these two areas of law and seeing how they are, enforcing and striking down laws using copyright, and then forcing upon us terms that are unfair, deceptive, and costly to libraries, seems to be the motivator. But my entire career is based on this statement. It doesn't have to be this way. So I think that's part of why this is a great question. We're like, they get both? They do if the laws are written the way they are currently. This is why we want to change them. I saw Alan unmute. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just I mean, that's all very good, Kyle. I would just say that I mean, you could have licenses with print books, right? Why not? But the fact that they're sold, I know, don't have a heart attack or later, Michael, but so like if you sell a print book to somebody, or if they, that we can circumvent that. They won't sell a print book to a library, well, they'll sell it to Michael, and Michael can sell it to the library, right? It's a physical object, and we could do that. But with digital stuff, right? We don't have an alternative. We don't have another way to get. We can't circumvent them like that, and so we're stuck, basically.
So yeah, so they do it because they can.
They do it because
is your answer there? They do it because they can.
They can, and they're profit maximizers, and they're maximizing.
They're in it for the money, and there's no question about it. And I'm not attacking capitalism here, just so much to say as libraries could use a more fair shake. From Brendan.
Exactly.
Yeah, if Amazon and Audible are giving access to libraries, which publishers, distributors are still not giving access? None of the big ones that I know of, individual titles. Anybody in a library try to get a ebook or Charlotte's Web?
Wait, didn't they just gank like 100,000 books from Wiley? Didn't that just hit the news the other day?
I didn't see it if so, but yeah, please, if you've heard that, great. And in academics, there might be some that I'm not aware of because I'm primarily public focused, but anybody know of any that it's not really playing at all with libraries right now? I think the big issue there is the huge number of titles that have never been digitized and never will because there's no profit margin in it. Micah, whom you heard from earlier, and I did a study a couple of years back, and we looked at some of the Pulitzer Prize winners from the 50s to the 80s. None of them digitized, but they're still interesting books to still be available to libraries digitally, and that's where we're not going to touch upon it now. Maybe our next session, controlled digital lending, please.
I would. Oh.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot what I was going to say. Go ahead.
Oh, and Will notes in the chat that it's the E.B. White estate is preventing the titles from being sold to libraries, not a publisher issue. But why are there Kindle copies of them available? I think you're absolutely right, and that is something that the heirs of that estate are not interested in. But why they have it in for libraries, I cannot tell you. In any case, there might be individual titles we're not getting, but I've not heard of a big publisher. Although they're looking at this Wiley thing. Thank you, Kylie. Thank you, Kyle.
Can I go back to the last question?
Yeah, please do. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So even if it's the case that we can get all digital titles today, which I don't believe is actually true, but suppose it is true, just like we saw with the Macmillan embargo, that can change tomorrow. And that, there's new management at whatever publisher or distributor or whatever who decides, well, actually, that library thing, that's not working for me. So, nix that. So that, so the issue is that libraries don't have rights, like we do under copyright law for analog materials. So the issue is that we have no long-term, position. And so so even if everything were great today, which it isn't, because the prices are still crazy and so on and so on. We need to do something because this is it's not good for us.
Well, in the remaining 8 minutes, we've got two huge questions we need to tackle, and that will leave a couple minutes for closing out at the end. The first question is, what do libraries think is fair? What would you say to a publisher if you could get a deal other than buying, and yes, buying these and owning them rather than licensing would be a huge step for libraries. But let's say we're stuck with licensing. What do you think is a fair license? And there might be a number of opinions on that. And two questions from our audience. Do you see vendors changing their business model as a result of these new state laws? And something that would be a follow-up. Have there been any discussions about the potential of a large-scale boycott to force more reasonable terms from publishers?
Michael, can I jump in real quick on that?
Sure. Yeah.
Especially the what libraries think are fair. I mean, I don't work for a library per se. I work for Digital Public Library of America, and we serve libraries all over the country. I have lots and lots of conversations with selectors and library directors about what they'd like to see, and we try to drive that with publishers. And I guess, this a little bit connects back to some of the previous connection. I don't personally think that all licensing should be lumped in as bad. I think that, there have been some experiments in the early days of library distribution, like in Jefferson County, around libraries taking possession of files vis-a-vis ownership that didn't really pan out from a technical perspective. So, in answer to the question about what libraries think is fair, what we have heard from a lot of libraries that they want is a couple things. One, options. There's no reason if you're licensing that there has to be one option. And then second, a mix of licenses that ideally includes something like DPLA's preferred models, which is the one at a time perpetual, which ends up functioning a lot like ownership, except for with regard to preservation, which in these popular trade books is not necessarily, the priority for the public libraries collecting them. The priority is principally access in combination with something else. So like we have the license model that's 40 lens up to 10 simultaneously. And then another that's five simultaneously. So that mix of licenses that can be used simultaneously and perpetually, some choices. And then I think fairness comes down to price. And, obviously that's, wildly variable, but, not too far off the retail price is what I've heard. So I guess just a plug that I think these tracks can be pursued in parallel. I strongly agree with Alan. We are working without a legal backstop on what publishers can do right now, which we have in the form of, the right of first sale for print books. But that at the same time, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There have been publishers, including some pretty big ones, Blackstone, Amazon and Audible, that are offering options that are working with us to try to bring more reasonable options to the table that, give libraries some choices. So I'll let others take it from there, but just a plug that we can drive these things in parallel, I think.
Two comments in the chat, one from Will and one from Thomas, talking about options specifically. And in Readers First, our message has long been, all right, licensing, we can live with it, but bring back that perpetual option. 3 of the big 5 have it in audiobooks. Why not in ebooks? There's not a single one that offer it in ebooks. You can charge more for it. So if, that's going to be the case, give us more of a break on these 2-year licenses. And in Maryland, we were defining fair basically as retail print cost for a license. And then Kyle, licensing is bad if it doesn't address core library missions, provide open, non-discriminating access to materials in service of public good. Absolutely, yes. So if, you can get a print equivalent deal on your ebooks, maybe maybe licensing is not a bad thing. We don't want to have 100.
It could be a great thing. It could be a great thing, except as long as the license isn't dictating our mission to us, right? They're like, oh, we're going to decide how long these loans are. We're going to decide how often you should pay. We're going to decide you don't own this. We're going to decide you can't preserve this. We're going to, or I feel like some of these licenses we're handing over our mission.
Yeah. In some cases, you can't quote from an ebook copy of something. It's like, what? Okay.
You can't read a book aloud.
Yeah. All right. So now we're going to pick up the big question, and that is, what are public libraries going to do? We passed the Massachusetts bill. Basically, the Massachusetts bill says you're going to have to do these things if you're going to work with libraries. And the publishers say, so what, Massachusetts, we don't care. What are we going to do?
We're going to destroy them in the press. The idea that even the idea, and I saw Carmi was on here too, that a coordinated effort to prevent libraries from having access is an okay thing, is wild to me. I think we still pay a lot of money. I don't know state by state dollar figures, but these ebook access is revenue generating, right? Libraries buying books is revenue generating. I don't think they'll leave the millions and millions of dollars that are at stake on the table for a small slice of the pie, right? So again, libraries aren't everything. For example, everyone hated in the publisher space open access when it first came around in 2008. And it's been around and it's propagated, right? Especially in this field. But think about the fact that Elsevier still made $2 billion last year. So everything worked out in the end. Corporations and publishers that have a mission to their service and libraries can coexist. They have for centuries. It's only recently with the influx of technology and licensing has this come to a head. I think there's a middle ground here to be had. And we're not dying on a hill. We're just trying to make it fair. And that's one of the major differences. This is why the lawsuit is such a shocker. Right, that idea, and Maryland going forth and leading in this state. Thank you for that. But that idea that I think it's a PR nightmare for them if they just leave all that money on the table. I mean, the stockholders might be angry too. What do you mean you're cutting all these deals?
Well, I'm sure that the public will get angry, and in Maryland, we're going to try to make sure they do. If so, two quick things to leave here. The first is Elizabeth said, libraries may not have rights, but the taxpayers who fund them certainly do. And I would argue libraries do have rights, but what I'll say is that this is all about our patrons. This is all about the people reading ebooks. This is about providing, especially to people who do not have the wherewithal to get all of their own ebooks. Thank you. And my tagline is always, you shouldn't have to have a credit card to be an informed citizen. Obviously, we don't have time to sort out the boycott issue here. I will say that if you're a library and the Massachusetts bill passes, or some New York bill passes, or a Maryland bill passes, and publishers pull out, I hope that you will come forward and stand with your fellow librarians on that as something that we will have to stand together on, or just stay exactly where we are now. Michelle asks, has a PSA been considered? Patrons have no idea what's going on. Canada may be ahead of us in that, but we're going to be working on it in a number of states. And just having the legislative attention to this has been huge. Articles in New York Times, articles in Washington Post, articles in Wired. Getting the word out there, I think a larger effort's going to be required, but I'm now flapping on and we've only got 2 minutes left. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to close out here and turn it back over to Jeremy and to Micah.
Well, thank you, Michael. It was an interesting conversation and exciting things brought to the forefront, no doubt. I want to thank all of our panelists this afternoon, Kyle, Briana, Alan, Irene, for your time and attention and sharing your experiences and knowledge with the audience today. I also want to thank Michael, our MC with the mostest, and his dulcet tones for a fantastic job moderating once again. This series has been brought to you by the Digital Public Library of America, Readers First, and the Chief Officers of State Library Agencies. We are having a great time as a triumvirate and would love to keep the conversation going. Lots of interest in a upcoming session on controlled digital lending. So keep an eye out for that. And we want to hear from you. We want to know what you would like to hear more about in the ebook issue and arena. So reach out to any one of those organizations. We'd be happy to hear from you and spin up another wonderful webinar. And I'll give the mic to Micah for any last closeout words.
I don't think I have much to add except for thank you all for joining, and thanks again to our fabulous panelists and for everyone who's following this important issue. So stay tuned for more Collaborating for Access discussions with our partners. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.